I called my son like I usually did. Before the line went quiet, I heard his wife say something that made my blood run cold. "Don't worry. The supplements are starting to work." I sat frozen in my truck, still holding the phone in my hand. They didn't realize the call was still connected. In that moment, I realized my family wasn't as good as I had always believed, and the biggest mistake they made was thinking I was too weak. Now I'm going to make a plan and teach them a lesson they will never forget. Welcome to the story. After hearing something like that on the phone, what would you do? Tell me in the comments and share where you're watching from. Take care of your health too. And a quick note. This is a fictional story with dramatized details created to make the narrative more meaningful and engaging. She has no idea we recorded everything. The words crackled through my truck speakers, sharp and cold, as the December rain hitting the windshield before the line supposedly went dead. I Soren Lancaster, a 70-year-old retired civil engineer who spent 34 years designing the invisible arteries of Portland's water systems, sat in my truck clutching a receipt for pipe fittings. My son, Thane Lancaster, a 39-year-old project manager whose confidence always seemed like a borrowed suit, called me every Sunday afternoon like clockwork. He had just hung up, or so he thought. But the Bluetooth in my Ford remained active, tethered to a ghost in the static. "Is he still foggy?" Jessamine Lancaster's voice was like a scalpel. Jessamine Thane's 37-year-old wife, who had spent 11 years treating our family dynamics like a floor plan she intended to gut and remodel, was always the voice behind the throne. More than usual, Thane replied, his voice muffled, likely moving through their kitchen. He forgot the appointment for the lawn service twice this week. Jessamine didn't skip a beat. "Good. The loan sharks aren't waiting, Thane. If he doesn't sign the power of attorney by the 15th, they will come for the house, our house. We need that $600,000, and we need him compliant." $600,000. A debt that large isn't a mistake. It's a structural failure. I sat paralyzed as the rhythmic thrum of rain on the aluminum truck roof intensified. The smell of damp floor mats and cold coffee suddenly felt suffocating. I wasn't listening to a family crisis. I was listening to a demolition plan. My own son was talking about me as if I were a piece of faulty infrastructure being phased out. My heart hammered against my ribs, a jagged, uneven rhythm that defied the methodical logic I had lived by for 7 decades. I looked down at the waxy Home Depot receipt in my hand. I had been planning to fix a leak in the basement, worried about the integrity of my home, while the real rot was festering in my own bloodline. The realization hit me with the force of a hydraulic surge. The senior moments, the drifting thoughts, the way I had started losing my keys in the refrigerator. It wasn't the inevitable erosion of age. It was being manufactured. In my 34 years as an engineer, I've seen concrete crumble and steel snap, but I've never seen a foundation rot from the inside out quite like this. "I am not losing my mind," I whispered to the empty cabin, my voice gravelly and trembling with a controlled anger I hadn't felt in years. "I am being dismantled." I began to run through the technical data of the last 6 months. The headaches always started an hour after breakfast. The blurred vision coincided with my afternoon tea. I reached out and touched the cup holder, where a half-empty bottle of memory support capsules sat nestled in the plastic. Jessamine had sent them. She insisted they were high-end supplements for cognitive longevity, a gift to keep me sharp. I thought of the bitter, metallic phantom taste that had lingered on my tongue this morning. It wasn't health. It was scopolamine or some other chemical tether designed to keep me in a state of suggestible haze. They weren't waiting for me to fade away. They were actively pulling the levers to dim the lights. I looked at the capsules, my hand trembling, as I realized the poison wasn't just in the static, it was in my kitchen cabinet. I didn't even take off my coat before I was at the kitchen counter, staring at the translucent amber bottle of memory support capsules like it was an unexploded pipe bomb. The clinical rattle of pills against the plastic echoed in the stillness of my Eastmoreland house, a craftsman I had painstakingly restored with my own hands. The house smelled of old cedar and the faint, lingering ghost of Patricia's perfume in the hallway. A scent that usually grounded me, but now felt like an indictment of my own blindness. I reached for the junk drawer, pulling out a hidden log I kept for tax purposes, but my focus shifted to a small, crumpled shipment receipt tucked in the back. It was a log of medications Jessamine had signed for while I was supposedly napping. She wasn't just sending vitamins. She was intercepting my actual blood pressure and cholesterol prescriptions, replacing the contents of those familiar bottles with these blue and white capsules. My own daughter-in-law had systematically dismantled my medical defense, turning my pharmacy against me. Input leads to output. I muttered, my voice echoing against the white subway tile. As an engineer, I understood systems. If you introduce a contaminant into a closed loop, the entire structure eventually fails. I sat at the kitchen table, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room, marking each second like a hammer on an anvil. I began to chart the dates in my mind. The first shipment arrived in June. My first major lapse, forgetting the turnoff for the freeway, happened exactly 14 days later. The dosage instructions she had handwritten on the lid were precise, calibrated to increase the fog, just as the legal documents for the power of attorney were being drafted. How many times had I swallowed that blue and white capsule with a smile, thanking my daughter-in-law for her thoughtfulness while she was effectively lobotomizing me? The thought brought the sharp, stinging copper taste of adrenaline into my mouth. I stood up, my joints stiff, and began a methodical sweep of the room. "You think I am too old to see the conduits, Thane," I whispered. I knew every inch of this house. I knew where the wires were pulled and where the shadows should naturally fall. I moved through the kitchen and into the living area looking for stress points. A retired engineer doesn't look for a hidden camera. He looks for the anomalies in the infrastructure. I saw a minute fracture in the dust pattern atop the bookshelf. They didn't just want my money. They wanted my silence. My gaze settled on a decorative World's Best Grandpa mug, a gift from Thane and Jessamine last Christmas. It sat on a high shelf angled toward the center of the kitchen. I reached up, my hand steady, despite the cold fury vibrating through my marrow, and pulled it down. The cold, smooth ceramic felt heavy wrong. I turned it over, peering into the hollow base of the mug, where the manufacturer's stamp should be. Instead, I found a pinhole lens and a high-gain microphone, its tiny LED blinking a rhythmic, silent amber. It was active. It was currently transmitting my heavy breathing and the quiet scrape of my shoes on the hardwood. I stared into the hollow base of the mug, my reflection distorted in the glaze, and I realized that at this very moment, they weren't just waiting for me to fail, they were listening to me realize it. I let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind of heavy, confused sound an old man makes when he has lost his place in a sentence. It was a performance, a mask of frailty. I pulled over my face as I stood in my own kitchen, staring at the porcelain mug. I knew they were listening. The high-gain microphone hidden in the base was a professional touch, but as I looked closer, I noticed the faint, blinking amber light through a microscopic gap in the ceramic. This was not just a recorder. It was a smart device linked to my home Wi-Fi, the very network my son Thane had insisted on upgrading for me 3 months ago to keep me connected. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, cold and jagged. I began to move, shuffling my feet with a deliberate lack of purpose. Where did I? Now, was it the drawer or the counter? I asked the empty air, my voice quavering just enough to satisfy a listener. I opened the junk drawer, rummaged through the clattering keys and loose batteries, then closed it with a sharp click before opening it again 10 seconds later. I needed them to hear the sound of a mind unraveling a structural collapse in progress. As I played the part of the senile father, my thoughts drifted to my late wife, Patricia. She had always been the more perceptive of us, a woman who looked at people the way I looked at bridge trusses, searching for the invisible points of failure. "She doesn't do anything without a blueprint," Soren, Patricia's ghost, whispered in my mind. She had been talking about Jessamine, of course, Back then, I had dismissed her warnings as cynicism, the byproduct of a life spent navigating social minefields. Now the silence of the house felt like an accusation. Grief is like a slow leak in a pressurized pipe. You do not notice the drop in capacity until the whole system is airlocked. For months, I had allowed my mourning to blind me to the erosion of my own safety. I stood there, the sharp, acrid taste of cold coffee at the back of my throat, realizing that my grief had been their greatest weapon. I turned off the kitchen light and retreated to my study, moving out of the immediate range of the mug's pickup. The air here was different, carrying the faint, lingering scent of stale lavender and old paper. The study was my sanctuary, the place where I had designed the infrastructure of this city. I looked at the dark wood of the mahogany desk and the rows of technical manuals. You see, when you have spent your life managing the flow of millions of gallons of water, you learn that the smallest crack is the most dangerous. I built systems to withstand floods, Thane. You think I cannot handle a leak in my own basement? The hum of the Wi-Fi router in the corner seemed louder now, a digital heartbeat for the spies in my life. I reached into the bottom drawer of Patricia's old roll-top desk, seeking comfort, and my fingers brushed against a piece of stationery I hadn't seen before. It was a note, the paper yellowed and slightly brittle to the touch. It was dated just weeks before the accident that took her. Her elegant script was hurried, frantic. Soren, if anything happens to me, do not give Thane the keys to the Eastmoreland house. Do not trust the help he offers. I sat at the desk, where I had planned Portland's sewage bypass, took a fresh sheet of drafting paper, and drew a single line at the top, Project Lancaster Structural Deconstruction. I stood in the upstairs hallway, far from the reach of the microphone hidden in the kitchen mug, and watched the dawn light hit the rain-slicked pavement through the window, as I dialed the only person who hated Jessamine more than I currently did. The smell of rain-washed cedar drifted through a slight crack in the frame, cooling the heat of the controlled anger rising in my chest. I listened to the rhythmic electronic chirp of the cell phone, dialing a sound that felt like a sonar pulse, searching for solid ground in a collapsing cavern. My sister-in-law, Cora Hayes, a 71-year-old retired librarian, who could spot a lie in a footnote from across the room, had always been the family's early warning system. When she finally answered, the scratchy, distant quality of her landline made her voice sound like it was traveling through decades of shared history. "Soren, you sound different," she said after a moment of silence. "More like your old self. Not that whispery ghost I have heard lately." I pressed the cold glass of the window against my forehead, closing my eyes. "I am back, Cora," I told her, my voice steady and analytical. "But I need to know what has been happening while I was gone." She did not waste time. Cora revealed that Thane had already consulted a local notary in Spruce Grove to discuss my supposedly deteriorating condition. "Thane called me Soren 2 weeks ago. He was asking about your judgment. He used the word capacity. Capacity. A 6-letter word that can turn a man into a ward of the state before his morning coffee gets cold. I felt the sharp, bitter taste of adrenaline spiking my morning pulse. It was the technical term for the kill shot the legal scaffolding required to build a conservatorship. I realized then that Thane was not just waiting for me to fade away. He was actively preparing the paperwork to bury me while I was still breathing. He framed it as concern. Of course, Cora continued, her tone sharpening. "But I have spent 40 years in libraries, Soren. I know when someone is looking for a specific chapter to justify a bad ending." He was fishing for testimony, asking if I had noticed any unusual behavior or forgetfulness. I tightened my grip on the phone. How long had they been poisoning the well of my reputation? Before they started poisoning the water in my glass, I told her to keep our conversation between us, explaining that I needed to remain a ghost for a little while longer. The structural integrity of my life depended on them believing the collapse was still in progress. But Cora had more to share, a detail that twisted the knife further into my ribs. She mentioned that Jessamine had been telling the rest of the family that I was the one who keeps calling them, begging for money I have already been given. It was a secondary layer of erosion, ensuring that if I reached out for help, my hands would find only closed doors. My own family was being trained to see me as a nuisance, a senile beggar. Soren. There is one more thing. Cora's voice dropped to a whisper, the sound of a secret being passed across a forbidden threshold. Thane was not alone when he visited me. He had a woman with him, not Jessamine, who kept taking notes every time I mentioned your house. I didn't wait to process the chill Cora had left in my bones. I tapped Clive Ostrander's name on my screen before the upstairs radiator could finish its morning groan. Clive Ostrander, my financial advisor for 30 years, was a man who lived by the decimal point and possessed a loyalty that was as rare as the vintage fountain pens he collected. As the call connected, I caught my own trembling reflection in the hallway mirror. I looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night, but my eyes remained steady. Clive, I said, skipping the usual pleasantries about our weekend rounds of golf. Listen to me carefully. Has anyone called about my beneficiary status in the last 72 hours? There was a brief pause, and I could hear the dry, parchment-like sound of Clive shifting papers over the phone. Actually, Soren, yes. He replied, his voice tightening with professional caution. A woman from a firm I have never heard of, Crane and Associates. She claimed to be acting on behalf of the family transition team. My pulse quickened. Clive mentioned that this consultant knew the exact date of Patricia's car accident, a detail I had kept private from all but my closest inner circle. The cold, metallic taste of fear settled in the back of my throat. She wasn't just guessing. She had been briefed with intimate data. Clive explained that she had asked for a full audit of the Lancaster accounts, specifically inquiring about probate avoidance and my $5.8 million portfolio. A $5.8 million portfolio is a high-pressure dam. Once a single hairline fracture appears in the security, the entire valley is at risk of being swept away. I felt the weight of that water pressing against my ribs. Clive dropped the real bombshell next. The consultant hadn't just been fishing for information. She provided a temporary power of attorney document via email to try and reset my online access credentials. The signature was a decent imitation, Soren Clive said, but it lacked the natural fluid pressure you usually apply to the tail of the L. I refused to authorize the change without a direct phone call to you. I leaned against the wall, the smell of dust and old wood in the quiet upstairs, filling my senses as the dull, rhythmic thud of my heart echoed in my ears. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were trying to delete me while I was still breathing. I realized then that the fog Jessamine was inducing with those supplements served a dual purpose. It wasn't just to make me compliant. It was to ensure that when Clive eventually called to verify the change, I would be too incoherent to remember the conversation or object to the breach. Clive, lock it down, I commanded, my voice returning to its methodical, analytical chill. Every penny. I want two-factor authentication that goes to a new device I haven't bought yet. I will be at your office soon. But Clive wasn't finished. He informed me that his security team had traced the IP address used to attempt the password reset. It was registered to a local construction firm, the very company where Thane is a senior project manager. My own son was using his office computer to pick my pockets. Soren Clive's voice turned somber, drawing my attention back to the gravity of the moment. She didn't just ask about the investments. She asked if the title to the Eastmoreland house was held in a way that allowed for an emergency collateralized loan. I spread the architectural blueprints of my estate across the oak kitchen table, using a heavy bottle of scopolamine-laced vitamins as a paperweight to keep the edges from curling. The cold, heavy weight of the oak table beneath my forearms anchored me as I moved into the midnight hours. I was no longer just a father. I was a forensic auditor examining a structure on the verge of total collapse. I found a series of gift tax filings in my own records that I had no memory of signing, totaling $150,000 over the last 6 months. The forgery was expert, but the timing was sloppy. My pen scratched against a yellow legal pad, the sound harsh in the silence of the dark kitchen. The clinical blue light of my laptop screen illuminated the flow of Thane's financial decay. Numbers do not lie, Thane. They just reveal the cracks you tried to plaster over. I cross-referenced the $600,000 figure I had overheard in the parking lot with the aggressive push for an emergency collateralized loan that Clive had mentioned. It was all there on the paper. $600,000 in debt and a $7 million legacy as the only collateral. My son had not just been losing money. He had been borrowing against a future he assumed was already his, selling the bricks of my life to pay for his own structural failures. In hydraulic engineering, we call it a water hammer, a sudden surge that ruptures the pipes because there is nowhere for the pressure to go. Thane is the hammer, and I am the pipe. But I have spent a lifetime managing pressure. I reached for the recording I had made in the Home Depot parking lot, playing the audio back through my headphones. The phrase, "She has no idea we recorded everything," looped in my ears. I leaned back, the faint metallic smell of the vitamin bottle wafting toward me. Jessamine was in the room when that was said, so she could not be the subject. I turned the problem over in my mind until the gears locked into place. It is Cora. Thane must have visited her, playing the part of the concerned nephew, to record her loyal defense of Patricia. He used her loyalty to Mother to bait a trap for me, likely twisting her words to make it sound like she was confirming my confusion. Do you know what it feels like to calculate the exact cost of your son's betrayal to the fourth decimal point? Project Lancaster structural deconstruction isn't just a plan anymore. It is a necessity. I unscrewed the cap of the memory support bottle and poured a single capsule into my palm. I had been suspicious of the scopolamine, but under the bright light of the desk lamp I saw something else. I crushed the pill with the base of a glass. Inside the white powder were tiny, high-concentration beads of a tracking dye. It was a chemical signature, designed to make the user look visibly jaundiced or ill for medical assessments, a way to provide physical proof of a failing liver or general systemic decline. I looked at the yellowed skin on the back of my hands, the sight of the jaundiced tint of my own fingernails, and then back at the bottle on the table. The physical evidence of my deterioration was already being written into my very biology. I kept my gloves on as I sat in Janet Cook's office, hiding the jaundiced yellow of my hands beneath dark leather, while I waited for her to tell me how a man loses the rights to his own pulse. The morning air in downtown Portland was thick with the scent of rain, but inside the 10-story high-rise, the atmosphere was dominated by the smell of high-end floor wax and expensive espresso. My lawyer, Janet Cook, a 55-year-old estate specialist with silver-streaked hair and a reputation for being the only thing in Portland tougher than a basalt cliff, didn't waste time with condolences. I laid out the blueprints of my ruin, the overheard recording of Thane, the scopolamine-laced memory support capsules, and the suspicious bank inquiries Clive had flagged. Janet listened with a clinical stillness, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the gift tax filings I had found in my records. She identified them immediately as pre-calculated legal breadcrumbs designed to prove a pattern of financial irresponsibility. Then she delivered the first blow. A petition for a temporary emergency conservatorship has already been drafted and saved in the local court's digital filing system. "Soren," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "It hasn't been submitted yet, but the fuse is lit." "Janet, they aren't just stealing. They're painting a portrait of a man who can't hold a brush anymore." I replied, the tight, suffocating feel of the leather gloves on my swollen hands making it hard to form a fist. "It's called a coordinated conservatorship petition, Soren. And in Oregon, it's a legal guillotine. A legal petition is like a retaining wall. By the time you see the cracks on the surface, the earth behind it has already shifted 1,000 tons. My son was using my own biology against me. Janet explained that by using the tracking dye to simulate jaundice and the scopolamine to induce confusion, Thane was creating a medical history that would satisfy any court-appointed visitor. She warned me that any direct confrontation would be a disaster. If you shout, you're aggressive. If you cry, you're fragile. If you hide, you're paranoid. They've built a cage where every exit is a trap. If I fought him now, he would simply trigger an emergency welfare check, using my high-tension reaction as further proof of instability. Imagine being told that the very act of defending your sanity will be used as the primary evidence to take it away. The muffled traffic of downtown Portland hummed 10 stories below, a world away from the silent war being waged in this room. We don't fight this with anger, Soren. We fight it with architecture. I watched the dry, rasping sound of paper sliding across her mahogany desk as she showed me more. Janet had been digging into the notary Thane visited, identifying him as a man she once investigated for rubber-stamping fraudulent healthcare proxies for Sylvia Crane's other victims. This was an industry of theft, and I was the latest project. My jaw tightened as I saw the sight of the temporary emergency watermark on the legal draft. Soren, look at the signature on this draft petition, Janet said, sliding a printout across the desk. It wasn't signed by Thane. It was signed by a medical professional, acting as a concerned, mandatory reporter. I walked 3 blocks past my parked truck, doubling back through a crowded coffee shop to ensure no one, not even the phantom mandatory reporter, was shadowing my movements toward the side street where I intended to buy my voice. The cold Portland air bit at my face, but I welcomed the sharpness. It kept my mind from drifting back to the signature Janet had shown me. I reached the side entrance of a high-end electronics and hobbyist shop on Jasper Avenue, a place that smelled of ozone and soldering flux. My phone buzzed in my pocket, emitting a sharp, rhythmic beep. I pulled it out and felt my stomach drop. A Find My Device alert blinked on the screen, a notification I had never activated. Thane was already tracking my physical location, in real time watching my coordinates move through the city grid like a cursor on a blueprint. I didn't disable it. To go dark now would be a signal of intent, a flare in the night. Instead, I stepped deeper into the shop, moving past the consumer-grade gadgets toward the professional equipment. I selected a digital recorder designed for field interviews, a slim, brushed aluminum device that could disappear into a shirt pocket and boasted a 40-hour battery life. The texture was cold and reassuring against my palm. "Does it have an auto gain for whispers?" I asked the clerk, keeping my voice low and level. He looked at me then, at the cash I was already pulling from my wallet. "It will pick up a heartbeat in a library, sir," he replied, his tone as neutral as mine. I paid in cash, the dry, papery feel of the bills, a familiar comfort from my years managing municipal contracts, where paper trails were either weapons or shields. Is it still paranoia? If you are holding the proof of the conspiracy in your trembling hand? I left the shop, taking a circuitous route back to my truck, my mind already building the test parameters for the device. Once inside the cab, I sat for a moment watching the tiny red record light reflecting in the rearview mirror. I tucked the recorder into my breast pocket and began to speak. Testing 1, 2. This is the black box for the Lancaster failure. Input deception. Output evidence. I recited the technical specifications of Portland's reservoir system, the familiar numbers of flow rates and pressure gradients, acting as a grounding wire for my racing thoughts. I needed to hear how the rustle of my shirt sounded, how my own movements might obscure the voices of the people trying to dismantle my life. A digital recorder is the ultimate engineer's tool. It does not care about family loyalty, it only cares about the frequency of the truth. I stopped the recording and hit playback, holding the device close to my ear to analyze the audio quality. The clarity was frightening, but beneath the sound of my own voice, the recorder picked up something else. A faint, high-frequency pulse that my own ears had missed. It was a rhythmic electronic chirping coming from the dashboard. I leaned forward, my hands searching the gaps in the plastic trim. I traced the source of the high-frequency pulse to the fuse box under my steering wheel and realized I was not just being listened to in my kitchen. My very movements were being broadcasted to a receiver I did not recognize. Fear is a vibration I usually only felt in bridge cables during a gale, but as I dialed Leonie's number from a public bench, it was humming through my own marrow. I had abandoned my truck 3 blocks away in a crowded shopping center lot, hoping the sea of metal and glass would confuse the transmitter signal long enough for me to breathe. The air in the Portland Plaza smelled of roasting coffee and exhaust fumes, a sharp contrast to the biting wind coming off the Willamette River. I pressed the slick, cold plastic of the phone against my ear, watching a mother push a stroller across the cobblestones. It was a jarring image of family safety that felt like a mockery of my current life. My eldest, Leonie Lancaster, a 42-year-old public health researcher in Boston with her mother's steel and my love for hard data, was the first to notice the cracks I tried to hide. When she answered, her voice carried a tinny digital compression that made the distance between us feel like an ocean. I didn't waste time. I described the high-frequency pulse in my truck and the chemical dye in the memory support capsules. Leonie went silent. Then I heard her sharp intake of breath. "Dad, do not take another one of those pills," she warned. "Scopolamine in low doses causes the exact fog you are describing. It is a common tool in elder fraud." Then she dropped the first anchor. "Thane called me in September, Dad. He sounded like a man drowning asking for a $75,000 loan. He told me you had already developed early-onset dementia and that I needed to pay to protect your estate. He used my own father's health as a lever to guilt me into covering his failures. $75,000. To Thane, it was a lifeline. To me, it was the price of my eldest daughter's silence. The revelation hit me harder than the cold wind. I had been a project to him, a problem to be liquidated. Leonie continued, her voice gaining the clinical edge she used for peer reviews. She told me Thane's construction project in Seattle had been in receivership for months. He was not just looking for a loan. He was hunting me. How do you reconcile the boy you taught to ride a bike with the man who is currently measuring the value of your life in loan shark interest rates? I found I had no answer for that. Leonie didn't wait for one. "I am booking the red-eye, Dad. We are not just protecting the estate. We are performing a structural rescue." She told me to go home, act normal for the microphones, and wait for her. She mentioned she has a colleague in the FBI's health fraud division who has been looking for a way to pin Sylvia Crane for months. We were no longer just reacting. We were coordinating. I warned her to be careful, knowing they might be watching the airport if they were tracking me this closely. "Dad, there is one more thing." Leonie's voice hardened into something lethal. I checked Thane's LinkedIn. He just updated his profile. He is listed as the managing trustee of the Lancaster Family Trust, and he backdated the entry to October. I stared at the paving stones, realizing the legal takeover was not just a threat. In his mind, it was already a finished monument. I stood near the baggage claim at Portland International. My shoulders hunched in a deliberate slump, playing the part of a man whose mind was slipping while my eyes scanned every face for the mystery woman Cora had described. The smell of jet fuel and overpriced airport Cinnabon hung heavy in the air, a scent that usually signaled the beginning of a holiday, but now felt like the prelude to a tactical extraction. I adjusted the vacant expression on my face, focusing on the conveyor belt with a glassy-eyed intensity. Leonie had revealed she didn't come alone. She had a private investigator friend trailing her from the airport to confirm if Thane had hired a physical handler to watch the house or my movements. When she finally appeared, walking through the sliding doors with a brisk East Coast efficiency, I felt a momentary surge of genuine relief that I had to quickly suppress. We performed our reunion for the invisible cameras. I let my hands tremble slightly as I reached for her. "You look tired, Dad. Did you remember your vitamins today?" she asked loudly, her voice pitched for the benefit of anyone eavesdropping in the crowded terminal. I offered a vague, non-committal mumble as we hugged. "The burner phone is in my bag. Don't look at it until we are in the house," she whispered into my ear, her grip firm and grounding. She took the keys to the truck, playing the role of the concerned, saintly daughter, taking charge of her failing father. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the rain-slicked pavement of the PDX parking garage, keeping the facade tight even when we were alone in the cab. I knew the transmitter in the fuse box was broadcasting our every turn. A lead-lined room is the only place in the modern world where the ghost of your privacy can actually sit down and catch its breath. We arrived at the Eastmoreland house under a bruised gray sky. Once inside, we navigated the kitchen with a scripted conversation about funeral arrangements for a non-existent friend. leading any listeners to believe we were safely distracted by the mundane tasks of mourning. I let my movements be slow and heavy until we reached the basement door. I slid the deadbolt into place with a sharp metallic click that felt like a declaration of war. We descended into my shielded workshop, a room I had built years ago with lead-lined walls for calibrating sensitive equipment. The cold, heavy weight of the door shut out the world, leaving us in a muffled, echoing silence. It is a clean room, Leonie. The signals won't get through the shielding. My posture straightened instantly, the analytical engineer returning to the surface. Thane wasn't just stealing my money. He was grave-robbing my future while I was still standing in it. Leonie sat at the workbench, the blue, flickering glow of her laptop screen reflecting in her eyes as she began to show me the digital trail. Thane didn't just backdate the trust. He has been using your social security number to open offshore accounts, she said. She produced a copy of the backdated trust document. I looked at the jagged edges of my own 2012 signature on that fraudulent piece of paper, realizing it was a wet signature from an old document he had physically cut and pasted onto this new fraud. Then Leonie hit a key on her laptop, revealing a live GPS feed that showed Thane's car was already turning onto Canyon Road. The gravel crunched outside like bone being ground in a mortar, a sound that usually signaled a welcoming homecoming, but now felt like the slow approach of a predator. I watched the monitors in the dim light of the basement workshop, the scent of damp concrete and warm electronics heavy in the air. Leonie didn't even look up from her screen as she whispered, "Stay low, Dad. He is here, but he is already a ghost in the system." I forced my breathing to remain rhythmic and shallow, maintaining the analytical calm that had defined my career as an engineer. Upstairs, Thane's SUV doors thudded shut. Leonie's fingers danced across her keyboard, bypassing security layers with a cold efficiency that made me realize I wasn't the only one in the family who knew how to dismantle a machine. She pulled up a series of archived files from British Columbia, her face illuminated by the stark blue glow of the display. "She is not a doctor, Soren. She is a professional scavenger," Leonie muttered, her voice trembling with a controlled anger that mirrored my own. We stared at a decade-old mugshot of the woman I knew as Dr. Sylvia Crane. The high-resolution photo showed a younger, harder version of the face that had been smiling sympathetically at me for weeks. She wasn't a doctor of finance or medicine. She was a disgraced former social worker with a string of dissolved shell companies behind her. "Look at the pattern," Leonie continued, pointing at a list of previous victims. "She targets estates with civil servants or engineers, people who trust the system because they spent their lives building it." I felt the metallic sour taste of bile in my throat as the magnitude of the betrayal settled in. How much of my son's love was real, and how much was just the lubricant Jessamine used to keep the gears of her greed turning? That question burned in my mind as Leonie opened a hidden directory. She found a deleted social media post from 5 years ago. It was a photo of Jessamine and Sylvia Crane at a high-stakes gambling resort in Macau, both of them holding champagne flutes and laughing. The connection was undeniable. Jessamine didn't just find this woman, she recruited her. They were partners in a long-term project where I was nothing more than the final payout. My son was the delivery system, but his wife was the architect of the poison. "We are going to Seattle," I said, my voice sounding like dry parchment. "If they want me to sign my life away, I want the recorder to capture the exact moment they realize I have out-engineered them. A scavenger doesn't kill. It just waits for you to stop moving." I wasn't going to stop moving. I watched the upstairs security feed as Thane entered the house. He wasn't alone in his intentions, and he wasn't empty-handed. He was carrying a thick, leather-bound folder. As he adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror, the basement monitor zoomed in on the top page of the stack. It was a pre-notarized signature block already stamped and dated by a third party. They had already secured a corrupt notary to verify my signature before I had even seen the documents. They weren't even going to wait for the ink to dry before claiming the estate. Upstairs, the heavy oak front door groaned open, and Thane's voice called out into the empty hallway hollow and practiced, "Dad, I've got the fresh eyes you needed. Are you ready to streamline things?" I rubbed my eyes until they were bloodshot and let my mouth hang just a fraction too wide, descending the basement stairs to meet the son who was currently driving a spike into the foundation of my life. The stairs felt steeper than usual, an obstacle course designed to test my commitment to this charade. As I reached the hallway, I saw Thane standing near the kitchen, his posture rigid. He was tapping at his phone with an intensity that bordered on the manic. I watched his thumb slide across the glass, and a small notification light on the wall panel flickered from green to dark. He had just disabled the home security system, not just the keypad alarm, but the internal motion-sensing cameras I had calibrated years ago. He was clearing the stage for my disappearance. "Thane, is it Sunday already?" I asked, my voice thin and wavering like a frayed wire. I thought I had more pipe fittings to buy for the downstairs sink. He turned a flash of irritation crossing his face before it was smoothed over by a mask of filial concern. "It is Friday, Dad. We talked about this. Leonie's here too, remember? We're going to get everything streamlined." He glanced toward the grandpa mug on the counter, his eyes checking the angle as if ensuring the hidden lens was capturing my confusion. Leonie stepped into the hall, carrying her laptop bag with a grip so tight her knuckles were white. She offered a strained smile, playing her part. "We are all ready, Thane. Let's get Dad settled in the truck." Thane insisted on driving my heavy pickup, claiming I looked too tired for the I-5 traffic. I climbed into the passenger seat, the smell of his expensive, nervous cologne filling the cabin. Driving north on the I-5 felt like being pushed through a one-way valve. The pressure was building behind us, and there was no way to reverse the flow. The rhythmic thrum of tires on the expansion joints of the highway acted as a metronome for my anxiety. I kept my hand in my pocket, feeling the cold, slick surface of the digital recorder. Every time Thane looked in the rearview mirror to check on Leonie, I felt like a specimen under a microscope. The gray, looming Seattle skyline began to puncture the horizon, a jagged teeth line of glass and steel. The traffic was a sea of red brake lights and rain-slicked asphalt. "The traffic is heavy for a Friday, isn't it, Thane?" I whispered, staring out at the Columbia River as we crossed into Washington. "Just stay relaxed, Dad. We're almost there. Jessamine has dinner waiting." How many times had we made this drive for holidays, for birthdays, for things that mattered? Only to have it end in a clinical execution of my autonomy. Thane took an unexpected exit in downtown Olympia, pulling the truck into the lot of a nondescript office building. He left the engine running, citing a need to pick up one last document for the meeting tomorrow. I watched him through the tinted window as he emerged minutes later, clutching the leather folder Leonie had seen on the monitor, the pre-notarized death warrant for my independence. We eventually pulled into the manicured driveway of the Bellevue house, the streetlights casting an artificial, too bright glow over the perfect lawn. As the engine died, I saw Jessamine Lancaster, my 42-year-old daughter-in-law, who managed a boutique real estate firm and specialized in predatory acquisitions, standing on the porch. Her smile was as fixed and artificial as the structural supports on a failing bridge. The heavy thud of the central locking system echoed through the quiet Bellevue street as Thane killed the ignition. It was a finality that felt like the dropping of a portcullis. I sat for a moment, my hands resting uselessly in my lap, maintaining the vacant stare of a man whose mind was a flickering bulb. Thane walked around to my side, his grip on my elbow firm as he guided me toward the porch, where Jessamine stood waiting. I stepped across the threshold of my son's home, feeling less like a guest and more like a specimen being ushered into a clean room for observation. The air inside was climate-controlled to a degree that felt sterile, stripping away the natural scent of the Pacific Northwest winter. We were led directly to the dining room, a space of glass and polished mahogany that felt more like a stage set than a sanctuary. Jessamine moved with a predatory grace, her silk dress whispering against her legs as she placed a steaming bowl of rosemary-roasted chicken before me. The scent was rich, but beneath the herbs, my nose caught a faint metallic tang, a chemical bitterness that didn't belong in a home-cooked meal. I watched her hands closely as she set a small crystal glass next to my plate. It contained a dark, amber liquid. It is a more concentrated blend. Soren, she said, her voice a practiced melody of concern. Dr. Crane suggested it might clear the cobwebs before our meeting tomorrow. I looked at the glass, then at her. Cobwebs. Yes. They seem to be everywhere lately, don't they? I replied, making sure my voice sounded thin and frayed at the edges. My eyes drifted to her own plate. She had served herself a noticeably smaller portion from a different dish on the sideboard, a subtle deviation that screamed of a separate, untainted supply. A dinner party with people who want you legally erased is like dining inside a pressure vessel. The atmosphere is thick enough to crush your lungs if you forget to breathe. I felt the heat of the chandelier pressing down on me, the light reflecting off the heavy silver cutlery with a blinding intensity. My throat tightened. I began to cough a dry hacking sound that I allowed to escalate until my face reddened. Leonie was on her feet in an instant, her instincts as sharp as the dinner knife she had been holding. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed bottle of mineral water. "Here, Dad, take this," she said, her eyes boring into Thane's with a challenge he wasn't prepared to meet. I waved away Jessamine's attempt to pour me a glass from the porcelain pitcher. "I'll just stick to the bottled stuff tonight, dear. My stomach has been as unreliable as my memory." I wheezed, twisting the plastic cap until it snapped. The sound of the seal breaking was the most honest thing in the room. Leonie didn't let the silence settle. "Thane, I heard the Bellevue waterfront project hit another delay," she said, leaning forward. "Is that why you're so eager to streamline things? How many times had I sat at this very table praising Jessamine's cooking, while she was calculating the exact moment my signature would become her property?" As Thane began a defensive ramble about interest rates, my foot brushed against something hard and unyielding beneath the table. It was a leather briefcase tucked neatly by Thane's chair. I knew that texture. It was the Olympia folder. I felt the hard edge of the briefcase against my ankle, and as Jessamine leaned in to help me with my napkin, her eyes met mine with a cold, predatory clarity that told me she knew I wasn't just thirsty, I was resisting. I withdrew my foot from the Olympia briefcase, the leather grain still pressing into my memory like a brand. Jessamine's gaze lingered on me, a predator evaluating a wounded stag, but I offered her nothing more than a weary, labored sigh. I needed to move. I needed to get away from the smell of that tainted tonic and the suffocating pressure of her expectations. With a hand braced heavily on the table, I pushed myself up my joints, popping in a way that required very little acting. I told them I was overwhelmed, that the noise was rattling my teeth, and that I needed a moment of quiet before retiring. I didn't wait for Thane's permission. I shuffled toward the stairs, my movements deliberate and heavy, feeling their eyes boring into the small of my back until I reached the safety of the upper hallway. I didn't head for my room. I went to Marigold's. I pushed the door open to find my granddaughter hunched over a desk littered with balsa wood and quick-dry glue. The room smelled of cedar shavings and childhood crayons, a sharp, clean contrast to the medicinal funk downstairs. As I watched her, I noticed a subtle tremor in her small hands, a lethargy in her eyes that didn't belong to a girl her age. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at the glass of apple juice on her nightstand. A faint, chalky residue clung to the rim. They weren't just drugging me. They were dosing the child with the same memory support capsules likely to keep her quiet and compliant while they dismantled my life. It was a calculated cruelty that made my blood turn to ice. I sat beside her, my analytical mind cataloging the structural flaws in her balsa wood bridge. If the anchor points are weak, Marigold, the whole span fails, no matter how beautiful the cables look. I whispered, my voice thick with a controlled rage I dared not show her. She looked up, her expression a mix of relief and profound exhaustion. A child should not know the vocabulary of legal guardianship. They should be worried about cable angles and ice cream. Yet here we were, two prisoners in a house built on my own sweat. We worked in silence for a few minutes, my steady hands guiding hers to reinforce the trusses. "Grandpa, why does Mommy say you are sick?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely a breath. "You are better at math than Daddy is." I felt a pang of chilled horror. I asked her what she meant, keeping my tone as light as a structural engineer discussing a minor stress fracture. She leaned in close, her eyes darting toward the door. She told me she had heard them practicing. They had a script on a yellow legal pad, she said, and her father had been crying while Jessamine read the lines aloud. They were rehearsing a phone call about me wandering off and being combative. I was looking at the future of my legacy, and I realized they were not just trying to steal my past. They were strip mining her future to pay for their present. Marigold reached under her pillow and pulled out her tablet, showing me a hidden calendar entry for tomorrow morning. There was a guest list, a notary named Miller, and a Dr. Crane. "Grandpa," she whispered, clutching a balsa wood strut until it snapped with a sharp, brittle crack. "Mommy told me if I did not tell the doctor the right story, you would have to go away forever." The hallway floorboards groaned under my weight as I retreated from Marigold's room, a sound that usually felt like the settling of a home, but now echoed like a warning. I stepped into the guest room and closed the door with a click that felt far too loud in the hollow silence of the house. My daughter's words vibrated in my skull, a rhythmic percussion of betrayal. I did not turn on the lights. Shadows are safer when you are the one being hunted. I moved with a practiced, clinical silence toward the shared wall of the master suite, my movements dictated by the structural blueprints I had memorized years ago. I lay on top of the guest room duvet with my shoes still on the digital recorder pressed against the base of the drywall, like a stethoscope searching for the heartbeat of a lie. The cold, dry rasp of a whisper drifted through the gypsum board, accompanied by the rhythmic mechanical hum of the master suite's air conditioning. I adjusted the gain on the small device, my fingers steady, despite the protective rage tightening my chest. Thane's voice came through first, thin and brittle. "He has to sign today, Jessamine," he said, his breath hitching. "The bank froze the Portland account an hour ago. We are out of time." I felt a cold, analytical validation settle over me. It was not just greed. It was desperation. Jessamine's response was a low hiss, devoid of the performative warmth she used in the kitchen. "He is too sharp tonight," she countered. "He did not drink the tonic. What if the doctor sees through the act? Lies are like air-entrained concrete. They look solid from the outside, but enough internal pressure will make the whole structure crumble into powder." I heard the distinct rustle of paper the yellow pad Marigold had described. They were reviewing a script, a choreographed sequence of failure they intended for me to perform. They were not just waiting for me to lose my mind. They were building a cage out of my own history. Jessamine's voice grew colder, more decisive. "Just a few more drops in his breakfast. He won't even feel the transition. Then the doctor handles the rest." Thane's protest was weak, the sound of a man drowning in his own debt. "I am not a murderer, Jess." She didn't hesitate. "You are a man who owes $800,000 to people who do not care about your family tree. $800,000. They didn't just mortgage my house. They mortgaged my soul." The scale of the theft was staggering, a structural failure of character so profound it rendered them unrecognizable as my kin. I felt the heavy metallic click of the digital recorder as I saved the file, the data migrating to the cloud, where Leonie and Janet would find it. I was the architect of my own defense now. I stared at the ceiling, my eyes adjusting to the gloom, calculating the variables for the morning. Then I saw it. In the far corner, nestled in the shadows of the ceiling, fan mounting a small plastic housing, caught a stray sliver of moonlight. I looked up and saw the tiny, unblinking red eye of the monitor lens staring back at me from the shadows, and for a heart-stopping second, I wondered if I'd just recorded my own execution. The lens was angled toward the bed, positioned perfectly to capture every movement, every secret I thought I was keeping in the dark. The morning sun cut through the blinds like a spotlight marking the start of a final inspection I had not consented to. I stayed in bed until the last possible second, my eyes fixed on that tiny red eye of the baby monitor, pretending to wake from a drugged stupor. When I finally descended to the breakfast nook, the smell of overly sweet cinnamon hit me, a cloying mask for the chemical bitterness of the oat sedative. I watched the liquid tremor in the spoon as Jessamine leaned over my oatmeal, her hand steady, while she delivered what she thought was the final blow to my mental independence. "Eat up, Soren," she said, her voice a fragile porcelain glaze of concern. "You need your strength for the meeting. It's a big day for the family." Strength? Yes. Big day. "Is the doctor nice, Thane?" I asked, slurring the S just slightly while maintaining a vacant stare. I realized then that the oatmeal didn't just have drops. It was laced with a fast-acting sedative meant to make me physically unsteady for the walk into the office, ensuring I looked every bit the crumbling patriarch they needed me to be. I performed a masterful sleight of hand, appearing to take heavy mouthfuls while actually depositing the sludge into a heavy cloth napkin hidden in my lap. Thane entered, his face a map of exhaustion and greed, clutching the Olympia documents that were the legal scaffolding for my erasure. He looked at me not as a father, but as a problem to be solved through paperwork. A skyscraper is just a vertical graveyard of ambition if the foundations aren't anchored in the truth. This building felt like it was floating on a sea of fine print as we pulled up to the glass and steel monolith in downtown Seattle. The drive had been silent save for the muffled, pressurized sound of the city outside. We entered the lobby and ascended to the 14th floor, the high-speed elevator making my ears pop, a physical reminder of the thin air they were forcing me to breathe. We stepped out into the offices of Crane and Associates. I cataloged the environment with an engineer's precision. The carpets were thick enough to swallow a footstep, designed to muffle sound and suppress any sense of urgency. The air was antiseptic and lemon-scented, a sterile atmosphere meant to sanitize the predatory nature of the business conducted here. Have you ever walked into a room and known with the absolute certainty of a structural load calculation that the floor was designed to give way the moment you stood in the center? That was this reception area. Thane whispered that the building signaled stability, but all I saw was a temporary set designed for psychological leverage. I looked at the receptionist, a woman with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes, and noticed her name tag. It matched the medical professional signature on the guardianship petition Janet had shown me. She wasn't just a clerk. She was a witness already bought and paid for. The inner office door opened, and a woman in a perfectly tailored white coat stepped out. Dr. Sylvia Crane, about 50, with the kind of practiced clinical calm that either signals deep competence or a deep performance, stood there like a predator in a lab coat. She extended a hand that was as cold as a morgue slab, while she said, "I've heard so much about your recent difficulties, Soren." I took her hand, allowing mine to limp slightly, my mind already calculating the decibel range of the recorder hidden in my jacket pocket. The click of the office door locking behind us was a final clinical sound, sealing the three of them in with the doctor like specimens under a glass slide. Sylvia Crane didn't just sit. She occupied the space behind her desk with the calculated stillness of a spider waiting for a vibration in the web. The dry, papery scent of old files and lavender air freshener filled the room, a smell that tried too hard to be comforting. She began by setting a thick folder onto the polished mahogany desk, her eyes scanning me with a predatory hunger disguised as professional concern. "Before we begin the cognitive evaluation, Soren, I should mention, I have already received a pre-signed recommendation for immediate conservatorship from a colleague I consult with regularly." This was the entry blow, a threat delivered with a smile. She made it clear that if I didn't cooperate with the voluntary measures, the involuntary ones were already in motion. "At your age, Soren, managing a $7 million flow can be overwhelming," she said, her voice dropping into a soothing, manipulative register. "Wouldn't you like to simply enjoy the garden?" I stared at my own distorted reflection in the desk's surface, performing the role of the confused Mark. "The garden? Yes. but the pipe's Dr. Crane, who watches the pressure when I am looking at the roses. I slurred the technical terms just enough to sound like a man losing his grip on the mechanics of his own life. Being assessed by a fraudster is like watching a plumber try to fix a gas leak with a roll of Scotch tape. You know exactly when the explosion is coming, but you have to wait for them to strike the match. I watched her look to Thane for confirmation, and my son nodded with a desperation that made my stomach turn. I asked her where she had studied, pointing a trembling finger toward the impressive frames on the wall. "Oh, I specialized in geriatric estate psychology at UBC," she lied, citing the institution Leonie had already confirmed had no record of her. "Geriatric. That is a heavy word, isn't it?" "Like a lead pipe," I muttered, watching the micro flinch in Thane's posture. He knew she was lying, yet he stayed silent. How many families had been optimized by this woman until there was nothing left but empty bank accounts and hollowed-out lives? The rhythmic, ticking sound of the high-speed wall clock felt like a countdown. Crane leaned forward, shifting the focus to what she called the family management instrument. I knew it for what it was, the irrevocable power of attorney. My mind was sharp, counting the seconds, recording every leading question and every fraudulent claim of expertise. Then my eyes caught a glimpse of a ledger on her desk, partially obscured by her sleeve. I saw a figure that made my blood run cold: $50,000. It was a consultation retainer paid directly from my local checking account, via a forged check I had never seen. She wasn't just being promised a cut of the future. She had already robbed me. The air in the room turned metallic and clinical as the charade reached its climax. She reached into the thick, mahogany-colored folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, the durable power of attorney. And for the first time, Jessamine's forced smile vanished, replaced by the look of a wolf finally closing its jaws. The cold, smooth slide of the paper against the wood was the only sound in the room. The gold-plated pen clicked with a sound like a hammer hitting a firing pin, and Sylvia Crane pushed it toward me with a smile that never once touched her predator's eyes. I reached out, my fingers trembling with a well-rehearsed frailty, but as my hand hovered over the document, I paused. I noticed a specific typo in the third paragraph, an extra character in the firm's address that Leonie had identified as a signature of Thane's business server. It was a digital fingerprint left by a thief. I picked up the pen, feigning a tremor that seemed to satisfy Jessamine's hungry gaze. But then I set it down with a sudden technical precision that caused the room to go still. "I require my own legal counsel to review this instrument before a single drop of ink touches the page," I said. The slur was gone. The foggy persona I had cultivated since breakfast evaporated, replaced by the veteran engineer who had survived decades of hostile contract negotiations. Sylvia's smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. "I've read enough blueprints to know when a load-bearing wall is missing, Dr. Crane." I continued, my voice steady and cold. "This isn't optimization, it's demolition." "Dad, don't be difficult." Thane stammered, his voice cracking. The smell of fear sweat rose from him in waves. "You're confused. Just sign it, and we can go home." Confused, no, Thane. For the first time in weeks, I see every line of the schematic. The pen wasn't just a pen. It was the key to a coffin they had spent 6 months building for me. The temperature in the office seemed to drop 10 degrees as the fraud was exposed. Jessamine lunged across the desk, her face contorting into a snarl as she attempted to snatch the document back. I was faster. I calmly folded the durable power of attorney and tucked it into my jacket pocket, feeling the cold, smooth texture of the paper settle directly next to my active digital recorder. "I will be taking the original instrument for my own records," I informed them. "It's my estate, my decision, my timeline. I'll let you know when the review is complete." "You aren't leaving with that," Soren Jessamine hissed, her mask finally shattering into jagged pieces of malice. Jessamine's rage was a flash flood, unpredictable and destructive, but I was a dam built of 30 years of reinforced concrete and civic duty. I looked at the heavy, rhythmic thud of my own pulse in my wrist, watching it slow into a tactical rhythm. I stood up, the fraudulent document heavy against my heart, and turned to the decorative plant by the door. I reached behind the ceramic pot and pulled out the full cup of herbal tea the receptionist had served me. I poured the amber liquid slowly into the soil of the fern. I didn't drink the tea, Jessamine, just like I didn't eat the oatmeal. I've been awake the whole time. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum created by the total collapse of their plan. I walked toward the door, my shoes clicking firmly on the carpet. I looked at Thane's shaking hands at the son I no longer recognized and whispered, "I'm going to a hotel, son. Don't follow me." I didn't wait for a response. As I stepped out into the antiseptic hallway, the weight of the evidence providing a newfound gravity to my stride. The elevator doors hissed shut, severing the sight of Jessamine's contorted face like a guillotine blade, leaving me in a 6x6 box of mirrored steel and deafening silence. I stood alone, the air in the car smelling of antiseptic and ozone as I descended from the 14th floor. My hands were white-knuckled around the folded, fraudulent power of attorney, tucked deep in my jacket pocket, its crisp edges a physical weight against my ribs. Neutralize the tracking, Soren. Find the crowd, I whispered to myself, my breath fogging the polished mirror. I watched the floor numbers count down with a clinical detachment, my mind already calculating the structural layout of the lobby. I knew Thane would expect me to emerge from the main entrance, so I bypassed the lobby level and took the car down to the basement. I exited through a heavy service door near the parking garage, the damp, cool air of the Seattle morning hitting me with the force of a liberation. I quickly opened a secondary transportation app Leonie had installed on my phone, watching the digital map with the intensity of a radar operator tracking a hostile contact. A silver sedan pulled to the curb within seconds. As I stepped inside, the muffled, heavy thud of the door closed out the city noise. I looked at the man behind the wheel, a stone-faced professional named Marcus Thorne, who Leonie had mentioned as a private investigator with a background in executive protection. He didn't ask for a destination. He already knew the coordinates of the safe house. The rhythmic digital chirp of the app confirmed the ride had started, but the stakes had moved far beyond a simple fare. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a fugitive in a tailored wool coat, carrying the blueprint of my own execution. I pulled the documents from my pocket, the cold, slick texture of my smartphone screen beneath my thumb, as I began the process of securing the payload. I photographed every page of the fraudulent POA and the draft of the temporary conservatorship Sylvia Crane had threatened me with. Using an encrypted app, I channeled the images to Leonie and Janet Cook, creating a digital redundancy before the original could be physically compromised. "Just keep heading toward the Pike Place Market, please." I like the foot traffic, I told the driver, though. My eyes remained fixed on the side mirror. The Seattle traffic was a clogged artery, and every red light felt like a stroke, threatening to stop my escape before I could reach the safety of the hotel. I watched through the rain-streaked mirrors as a black SUV Thane's vehicle swerved out of the parking garage 2 blocks behind us. The pursuit had transitioned from the boardroom to the pavement. Marcus gripped the wheel, his gaze flicking to the rear view. "He is on the phone," Soren Marcus said, his voice a low growl of warning. "My partner is monitoring the local bands. Thane isn't just following us. He is calling the police. He's reporting you as a missing endangered senior with dementia to force a traffic stop." The realization hit me with a jolt of adrenaline. A blue and red flash mirrored against the glass of the skyscraper ahead of us, and Marcus tightened his hold on the steering wheel. "They're calling in a silver alert, Soren. If we get pulled over, they take the documents, and you go to a psych ward." The PI didn't slow down for the siren. He accelerated through a yellow light and veered into the dark, concrete maw of the Hyatt Regency parking garage, killing the lights before the gate could even finish its descent. I sat low in the passenger seat, my pulse a rhythmic hammer against my ribs. Elias, a 60-year-old former Seattle detective with a face like a weathered coastal cliff, and hands that had spent decades dismantling white-collar cartels, didn't need to be told the stakes. He had been a shadow in my life for months. A sentinel Leonie hired the moment she realized my letters were being intercepted. I realized then that he wasn't just an Uber driver. He was a specialist in financial crimes who knew exactly how to navigate a city that was suddenly hostile to my presence. We bypassed the main lobby, slipping through a service corridor that smelled of hotel-grade carpet cleaner and industrial laundry. The room Leonie had booked was on the 9th floor, registered under her maiden name to break the digital trail. When the door opened, the cool, stagnant air was replaced by the heat of high-end electronics. Leonie was there, the flickering blue glow of 3 laptop screens reflecting in her eyes. She moved toward me instantly, her hands steady as she performed a quick physical check. "Dad, don't touch your eyes," she warned. "That jaundice dye is toxic in high concentrations." "Elias, is the room clean?" Elias moved with practiced efficiency, the rhythmic mechanical clicking of his bug sweeper filling the silence as he established our temporary war room. Swept and shielded Leonie, he grunted. "We've got 20 minutes before Thane's PI figures out we swapped cars in the shadows of the basement. Discovering a lien on your home is like finding termites in the foundation of your soul. The structure looks fine from the street, but the weight of your life is resting on hollow wood." I sat at the small hotel desk watching Leonie access a secure portal to the Oregon property title records. She didn't look at me as she pulled up the Eastmoreland deed. "Look at the pixelation on the S, Dad," she said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "It's a digital graft. They mortgaged the house for $800,000 while you were napping in the guest room." I leaned closer, my analytical mind cataloging the jagged artificial edges of my own signature on the screen. $800,000. My son didn't want an inheritance. He wanted a bailout. I have lived in that house for 30 years, Leonie. I paid it off in 2009. They didn't just steal my savings. They sold my roof to a loan shark. The engineering-grade fury I felt was cold and structural, a recognition of a total failure in the people I had raised. We looked at the notary stamp on the fraudulent mortgage. The name didn't ring a bell until Leonie cross-referenced the registration. The notary was Jessamyn's brother, operating out of a post office box in Olympia. It was a closed loop of familial betrayal. Dad, Leonie's voice went small as she scrolled further down the digital deed. "It's not just a mortgage. There's a clause here for a quick sale power of attorney. If you don't sign that paper in Sylvia's office today, they've already authorized the lender to seize the house by Monday morning." The trap was finally fully visible, a legal mechanism designed to leave me homeless and erased before the new week could even begin. I ignored Elias's warnings and Leonie's pleas, climbing back into the sedan with the forged deed clutched in my hand. I wasn't going to hide in a hotel while they prepared to sell the roof from over my head. The drive back to Bellevue was a blur of rain-slicked asphalt and cold, analytical preparation. I pulled into the driveway at dusk, the house glowing with a sterile, deceptive light that mocked the rot within. The crunch of expensive gravel under my heavy boots signaled my arrival. Thane and Jessamyn were already outside, their faces frantic in the flickering orange glow of the street lamps. They had clearly realized I had slipped their leash at the office. "Dad, where have you been?" Thane shouted, his voice cracking with a manufactured panic. "We were about to call the police." I stepped into the light, no longer stooped or performing the role of the foggy patriarch. "I've already spoken to the police, Thane," I said, my voice dropping to a frequency that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "And the bank. Now let's talk about the $800,000 you stole from my house." I held up the printout of the lien like a death warrant. The cold, biting wind whipped the paper in my hand, but my grip remained absolute. I could see the metallic, sharp taste of adrenaline in their eyes, a pure, unadulterated loathing. Before I explain how I found the digital fingerprint on this forged document, I need to know if you are still with me in this moment. Comment 5 if you think they can justify this, or 10 if you think it is pure malice, and add one short reason. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is, What I hope stays with you. I gestured toward the street where Elias sat in the shadows of the sedan, pointing a high-gain shotgun mic toward us to capture every word. Thane's knees seemed to buckle, and he collapsed onto the pavers, a sobbing mess of a man. Jessamine, however, did not crumble. She stood her ground, the smell of her expensive floral perfume mixing with the damp scent of pine needles. "You're sitting on $7 million, Soren." She snapped her mask, finally shattering. "You will never spend it all." We just needed a bridge to get through the month. $280,000. My daughter-in-law had gambled away more than most people earn in a decade at a tribal casino, and she expected me to pay the tab with my sanity. Watching my son weep on the concrete was like watching a dam burst. There was no strength left in him, only the muddy debris of a life built on shortcuts. "A bridge?" I asked, stepping closer until I could see the jagged lines of her pupils. "You poisoned me, Jessamine. You forged my name to a loan shark. That is not a bridge. That is a trapdoor." She just smiled, a thin, jagged line of teeth that sent a chill through my bones. She wasn't seeking forgiveness. She was seeking leverage. "Where is my granddaughter, Jessamine?" I asked, my pulse finally slowing into a lethal, tactical rhythm. Her smile widened. "She's with the doctor now, Soren. You might want to think very carefully about your next move." The realization hit me like a physical blow. They had moved Marigold to a safe house with Sylvia Crane's associates. The war wasn't over. It had simply changed its shape. I didn't lunge at Jessamine. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the digital recorder, the red light glowing like a steady, accusing eye in the twilight of the Bellevue driveway. The savage instinct to wrap my hands around my son's throat was there, vibrating in my marrow. But I am a man of blueprints and load-bearing logic. I do not destroy. I analyze. I watched the color drain from Thane's face as I informed him that I had already contacted the bank's fraud department while in the Uber. His access to all shared accounts had been terminated 10 minutes before I arrived at the curb. He was standing on a foundation of air, and the drop was going to be lethal. I held the recorder up between us. The smell of damp earth and Jessamine's fading floral scent swirling in the cool evening air. "Every word you have said, every threat against Marigold, has been transmitted live to Leonie and my security detail," I said, my voice reaching that low, gravely resonance of a final judgment. "You didn't just break the law, Thane. You broke the fundamental physics of this family." I watched him scramble for a lie, but his eyes were empty, searching for a script that no longer existed. "Dad, please, we can fix this." He stammered, his voice thin and pathetic. "No," I replied, stepping back toward the idling car. "You cannot fix a foundation that was poured with rot. There is no remediation for a heart that views its father as an ATM." He looked at me then with a flash of the boy he used to be, but that boy was a ghost I had buried years ago. I delivered my final assessment with the surgical detachment of a structural engineer condemning a high-rise. "Your mother would have caught this sooner, Thane. She was better at reading people, but I caught it in time to save Marigold." Jessamine began to scream, a shrill, jagged sound that tore through the quiet of the Bellevue neighborhood, but I didn't turn back. I signaled Elias to pull the car around the crunch of gravel beneath the tires, sounding like the first stones of a landslide. Leaving that house felt like walking away from a controlled demolition. You don't look back at the dust, you just make sure no one else is standing in the debris field. I climbed into the sedan. The sharp, clinical taste of the recycled air hit me as the door thudded shut, sealing out the wreckage of my son's life. As we pulled away, I looked through the rear window and saw Thane collapse onto the manicured grass, a man whose life's work was stealing his father's, only to end up with nothing but the rain and the debt. The rhythmic click-clack of the turn signal in Elias's car provided a steady pulse to my own cold adrenaline. "Elias, drive," I said, my hand tightening around the cell phone. "We have a child to retrieve." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "We tracked Sylvia Crane's burner phone signal to a motel in Tukwila," he informed me. "It is just 20 minutes away." The cold, heavy vibration of the phone in my palm made me flinch. I watched the Bellevue house shrink in the rearview mirror, a monument to greed glowing in the dark. And then my phone buzzed with a text from Leonie. "The FBI is on site at the motel. Stay in the car." I sat in the back of Elias's car, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof, while the blue and red strobe lights of the FBI units turned the dingy motel parking lot into a nightmare of neon and shadows. The acrid smell of wet asphalt and gun oil seeped through the vents, grounding me in a reality that felt far removed from the quiet engineering labs where I had spent my life. I had already sent a duplicate encrypted copy of all my recordings to the Oregon State Police as we crossed the state line, ensuring local charges would stick, regardless of federal proceedings. I am a man who believes in redundancy. A bridge doesn't fail because of one weak bolt. It fails because of a systemic lack of oversight. I watched the scene unfold with the clinical detachment of a structural inspector. The muffled, echoing sound of a motel door being kicked open shattered the rainy silence. Agents breached room 112 with a precision that was almost beautiful in its efficiency. Seconds later, they emerged with a dazed, small figure wrapped in a heavy tactical jacket. Marigold. Leonie rushed forward, her silhouette cutting through the strobing lights, to take the child into her arms. I felt a decade's worth of structural tension finally snap in my chest, a release so violent it left me physically hollow. "She is safe, Dad. She is safe." Leonie's voice crackled over the burner phone in my hand. My eyes never left the motel doorway. "Take her to the hospital," I replied, my voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Don't let her see that woman's face again." As I spoke, Sylvia Crane was led out in handcuffs. Her carefully cultivated doctor's composure had dissolved, replaced by the frantic twitching calculations of a cornered criminal trying to find a loophole in a steel trap. Watching them carry Marigold out was like seeing the last piece of a collapsing bridge stabilized. The damage was done, but the fall had stopped. The salty, metallic taste of the rain on my lips reminded me that I was still breathing, still standing amidst the wreckage. Agent Vance, a man who looked like he was carved from the same hard granite as the federal building he worked in, approached the car. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gait that commanded the space around him. I lowered the window, the cold mist drifting inside. I handed him the black box, my digital recorder, along with the SD cards, containing the photographs of the scopolamine-laced supplements and the forged $800,000 deed. "Everything you need is on this card." "Agent," I stated, my tone devoid of emotion. "The motive, the method, and the physical harm. It is all documented. Evidence is a mirror." Thane and Jessamine were about to see exactly what they had become. Vance accepted the recorder with the reverence usually reserved for a bomb trigger. "You've done our work for us, Mr. Lancaster," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "This isn't just elder abuse. It's a federal racketeering case. We've been tracking this cell for months, but we lacked the internal documentation you provided." He leaned in slightly, his eyes reflecting the blue strobes. "By the way, Jessamine's brother was picked up in Olympia an hour ago. He is currently singing to avoid a 20-year sentence." He looked at the digital recorder, and then at me, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "We have enough to arrest your son and his wife tonight, Soren. Do you want to be there when it happens?" The interior of the hospital ER felt like an interrogation room, the fluorescent lights humming with a low-frequency buzz that vibrated against my skull. I declined the wheelchair at the hospital entrance, gripping the cold aluminum rail with my yellowed hands. I needed to know if the fog I had been performing had become a permanent part of my internal architecture. Every step was a calculation of balance and resolve. I was led into a high-security ward where the antiseptic sharp smell of isopropyl alcohol stung my nostrils. Dr. Aris, a specialist in neurotoxicology, who looked like he'd spent his entire life under the unforgiving glare of lab lights, spoke with a precision that only another engineer could truly appreciate. As he began the toxicology sweep, He discovered a second unknown synthetic compound in my blood, a heavy metal isotope. Leonie, pale and focused, identified it instantly as a tracer used in high-end construction materials. It was the final structural proof Thane had stolen the poison from his own job site. I sat in the sterile light while they drew vial after vial of my life force. The rhythmic, high-pitched beep of the heart monitor provided a secondary pulse to my own cold dread. I felt the cold, slick feel of the ultrasound gel on my temple as they scanned for vascular damage. Leonie monitored the lab results in real time, her eyes darting across the screen. "Leonie, look at the liver enzymes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "They are spiking." How much longer could I have held the pressure? She didn't look up, but her hand found mine squeezing hard. "We caught it in the 11th hour, Dad. Any more and the damage would have been systemic. Being quantified by a blood test is like reading a stress-strain curve for your own soul. It tells you exactly where the material began to yield and how close you came to the snap." I was no longer a person to them. I was a set of data points, a biological system approaching critical failure. I endured the bitter metallic taste of the contrast dye injected for the scan, watching the stark, ghostly white of the MRI films appear on the lightbox. "Doctor." Eris eventually called us into a small consultation room. "Mr. Lancaster, this wasn't an accident," he said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "This was a pharmacological lobotomy in progress." He explained that the scopolamine dosage was meticulously calibrated to mimic early-onset dementia without triggering acute organ failure, at least not yet. He revealed that another 6 to 12 weeks of the supplement regimen would have caused permanent hippocampal atrophy, effectively erasing my ability to form new memories. 6 months. They spent 180 days turning my brain into a crime scene. So the fog wasn't just a performance, I realized aloud. I was actually disappearing. My own son was clinically murdering the man I used to be, one capsule at a time. Yet a strange anomaly surfaced in the results. Despite the drugging, my mathematical processing speed had actually improved as a survival mechanism, my mind tightening its grip on logic as the chemical tide tried to pull it under. I looked at the MRI of my own brain, the dark patches of chemical interference staring back like shadows in a basement. And then Agent Vance walked in his face, grimmer than before. "We have a problem, Soren. Thane and Jessamine aren't at the house anymore." The heavy rain hammered against the hospital windows, a relentless drumming that threatened to drown out the low hum of the MRI machine. I felt the cold, antiseptic air of the ward prickle my skin as Agent Vance delivered the news. "They didn't just leave the house, Soren. They cleared the safe and ditched their cell phones at a rest stop on II-5 North," he said, his voice competing with the rhythmic, mechanical wheeze of my oxygen mask. I closed my eyes, the bitter copper taste of stress-induced dry mouth coating my tongue. I realized then that Jessamine had a second pre-packed suitcase filled with $100,000 in cash money she had been skimming from Marigold's college fund over the last year. It was a calculated long-term theft, a slow bleeding of her own daughter's future. My son and his wife were attempting a desperate run for the border, using the specific heavy metal signature of the construction tracer. Leonie had identified, the FBI had already tracked the isotope to a rented industrial truck moving toward Bellingham. My mind, sharpened by the very survival mechanism the toxins had triggered, began mapping the logistics of their flight. "He will take Highway 9, I said, my voice raspy and thin through the mask. "He thinks like a contractor trying to dodge a permit inspector. He will avoid the Peace Arch and the main way stations." Vance nodded, tapping a command into his laptop. "We have already got a perimeter at the Peace Arch, but Highway 9 is where we will squeeze them." I watched the GPS track on his screen, a flat line-like trail snaking toward the Canadian line. He was my son, and now he was a blip on a tactical radar being hunted like a structural defect. The primal urgency I felt was tempered by a bitter satisfaction. My technical insight was the final bolt in their cage. Leonie stood by the bed, her hand resting on my shoulder, as Vance patched in the live audio feed from the field team. The static-filled, distorted shouts of the FBI tactical radio filled the room. Box them in, corner the rental, Soren. Are you listening? Thane's voice suddenly broke over the radio, a desperate, pathetic frequency that made my stomach churn. I am sorry. I listened to the screech of tires and the amplified commands for the suspects to exit the vehicle. The sound of the handcuffs clicking over the radio was the final bolt being driven into the casket of our relationship. It was a soul-crushing mixture of justice and the absolute death of a father's pride. The recording captured Jessamyn's hysterical screaming as she attempted to throw a bag of forged documents into a roadside drainage ditch, a futile effort to destroy the evidence of their federal racketeering. The associate driving the getaway truck was pulled out next. It was the corrupt notary from Olympia trying to flee before he could be forced to testify. We have them, Soren Vance said, closing his laptop with a definitive thud. But Sylvia Crane's network is bigger than we thought. She just activated a kill switch on your digital accounts from a remote server in Vancouver. I looked at Leonie, whose face had gone pale, as she watched the account balances on a secondary monitor begin to drop towards zero. The battle had shifted from the asphalt to the ether, and the stakes were now every cent I had earned to protect my family. The numbers on Leonie's screen were hemorrhaging in real time, a digital arterial bleed that threatened to empty my life's work into a black hole account in the Cayman Islands. I watched my breath hitching against the rhythmic pulse of the hospital monitor as the blue, flickering light of her laptop cast skeletal shadows across my pale face. The rapid-fire clicking of her keyboard was the only sound in the room, save for the hum of the HVAC. I felt a cold, unyielding pressure from the blood pressure cuff on my arm, a physical manifestation of the tightening noose Sylvia Crane had left behind. But Sylvia had underestimated my paranoia. Years of navigating the treacherous waters of high-stakes logistics had taught me to never leave a flank exposed. Even as my balances plummeted, I knew my own contingency was already in motion. I had prepared a dead man's switch months ago, a predated letter to the IRS detailing every financial irregularity in Thane's firm. If they drained me to zero, I would ensure their entire world burned alongside my savings. I've got the handshake protocol, Dad. Leonie whispered, her eyes never leaving the cascading code. The bank is locking the outgoing transfers now. I gripped the thin hospital rail. It's not about the money anymore, Leonie. It's about making sure the ink on their lies never dries. We watched the digits freeze, hovering just pennies above a total wipeout. The digital dam held, but the war was shifting from servers to the bar of justice. A virtual courtroom is a sterile theater of justice. The judge's gavel is just a digital sound effect, but the weight of the verdict still crushes the breath out of the guilty. By 9 a.m, the smell of stale hospital coffee and ozone filled the air as the screen split. Judge Holloway appeared on the monitor with the weary, ironclad authority of a woman who had seen the worst of human nature reflected in probate law for 30 years. I sat, propped up against the pillows, my voice rasping but steady, as I gave my sworn statement. I detailed the scopolamine, the clouded days of chemical coercion, and the moments Thane had guided my hand to sign away my soul. The evidence Leonie had salvaged from my basement logs spoke louder than my own trembling words. Based on the evidence of pharmacological interference and the verified forgery, this court finds the lien null and void, Judge Holloway declared. Voided. One word to erase the $800,000 chain they'd wrapped around my home. The relief was a physical weight lifting off my chest, yet the screen immediately shifted to a grimmer view. The Bellingham holding cell appeared, showing Thane and Jessamyn. My son looked smaller than I remembered, his expensive suit rumpled and his spirit seemingly extinguished. Dad, please tell them it was just a mistake. Thane's voice echoed through the hospital speaker, tinny and pathetic. I remained silent, my analytical mind recording his desperation without a flicker of pity. Before he could beg further, Jessamyn's lawyer stepped into the frame, his expression devoid of loyalty. He moved to immediately separate her case from Thane's, stating that Jessamyn was prepared to testify that my son was the sole mastermind behind the poisoning. I watched the screen as Jessamine turned to Thane in the holding cell, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated venom, and whispered something that made my son fall to his knees and wail like a wounded animal. The hospital room was thick with the scent of clinical antiseptic and the sharp, oily tang of fresh printer toner. I signed the first of the 400 pages with a hand that no longer trembled, the ink biting into the paper with the same finality I once used to approve a bridge's seismic retrofitting. The screen on the wall had gone dark, swallowing the image of my son collapsing in his cell, leaving only the rhythmic mechanical chirp of my heart monitor. I looked at Janet Cook, who sat at my bedside with a stack of documents so thick they looked like a weapon. We were not just revising a will. We were performing a controlled demolition of the parasites who had tried to hollow out my life. I want a scorched earth clause, Janet. If Thane so much as looks at a casino, the trust locks him out of the state. I watched her nod as she flipped to a specific section. This new structure included a restitution clause that I had insisted upon, a legal siphon that would automatically funnel every cent of Thane's future earnings into paying back the $800,000 fraudulent mortgage. He would spend the rest of his life working to repair the hole he had dug. We are moving the assets into a multi-generational sovereign trust, Soren Janet explained. It is the legal equivalent of a bunker. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction as I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner Leonie had linked to the documents. This trust for Marigold would be guarded by a redundant system requiring both Leonie and Cora's verification. My granddaughter would be a queen in a fortress her parents could never storm. A will is just a blueprint for the dead, but a trust is a living machine. It functions long after the architect has left the site. I watched the heavy gold fountain pen scratch across the heavy bond paper, the sound amplified in the quiet room. Leonie stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the first few rays of sun breaking through the gray Seattle clouds. The hum of a secure video link brought Cora Hayes onto the secondary monitor. Her breathing was shaky, digitized, and thin as she looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. Soren, I should have known he was baited by that woman, she whispered. I caught Leonie's gaze and then looked back at the screen. You provided the data point that saved my life, Cora. Now I need you to help me hold the line. Do you know what it's like to write your own son out of your history with the same clinical precision you'd use to remove a tumor? It is not an act of hate. It is an act of survival. By the time we reached the final page, the weight of the legal seals felt cold and heavy on the desk. Janet leaned in, her voice dropping as she checked the hallway. There is one more thing, Soren. Jessamine has already signed a full confession against Sylvia Crane in exchange for a reduced sentence. It is over for the Crane network. I handed the final signed document to Janet and looked out the window at the clearing, Seattle sky, only to see a man in a dark suit I did not recognize standing at the end of the hospital corridor, watching us. He didn't move, his gaze fixed on my door with a stillness that chilled the newfound warmth in my chest. I didn't reach for a panic button. I met the gaze of the man in the dark suit with the steady, unblinking focus of a bridge inspector who had found a hairline crack in a primary support pillar. As he approached, the clinical light of the hospital corridor revealed a familiar set to his jaw. Special Agent Miller, a man who carried the quiet, heavy stillness of a federal vault and wore a suit that cost more than my first car, didn't look like a stranger once he started talking shop. I recognized him then. We had consulted together years ago during my tenure at the Department of Transportation when a massive bid-rigging scheme threatened the state's infrastructure. Now he was the FBI's expert on infrastructure-related money laundering. He explained that Sylvia Crane's network had deeper roots than originally estimated. Mr. Lancaster, you didn't just catch a fraudster. You exposed a clearinghouse for predatory guardianships, he said, his voice as dry as parchment. I leaned back against the hospital pillows, feeling the residual ache in my chest. I just wanted my house back, I replied. I didn't realize I was dismantling a factory. He informed me that my meticulous logging of every anomalous transaction and chemical symptom had made me the crown jewel of the prosecution. Because of the scale, This was moving into a massive RICO case, requiring immediate witness protection protocols for myself and Marigold. The weight of it was a physical pressure, a reminder that systemic rot is never contained in just one room. A plea deal is the legal equivalent of a controlled burn. You let a small part of the forest die to save the surrounding timber. 24 hours later, I stood in a secure federal facility in Seattle. The smell of ozone and floor wax was aggressive, and the dry metallic taste of recycled air coated my tongue. I watched through a one-way mirror, the cold, fluorescent glare reflecting off the glass, as Thane sat in an interrogation room. Thick blue federal folders were spread across the table like blueprints of a failed project. Agent Vance stood beside me, his arms crossed. He's giving them everything Soren, Jessamine the notary, even the construction foreman who supplied the tracers. I watched my son's mouth move, the muffled, distorted sound of his voice coming through the intercom as he traded names for a chance at a minimum security annex. My son sold his wife for 10 years off a sentence. At least the market value of his loyalty was consistent. He always was a man of efficiency, Janet, I said to my attorney as she joined us. He just finally applied it to his own survival. I watched without pity as the man I had raised dismantled the remains of his own life with clinical precision. There was no familial hope left to die. That had perished weeks ago in a basement filled with scopolamine. But then Thane dropped a final jagged truth. He claimed the original idea for the poisoning didn't come from Jessamine, but from a support group for struggling developers run by one of Crane's shell companies. It wasn't just a family betrayal. It was a curated seduction by a predatory industry. As Thane signed the final confession, he looked up at the one-way glass as if he could see the ghost of the father he tried to erase and mouthed a single word: run. I let the mail pile up on the oak sideboard for 3 days, afraid that even a paper envelope might hold enough residual venom to restart the fire I'd barely managed to extinguish. The heavy iron gates of the Eastmoreland estate had swung open with a screeching groan, the hinges screaming for the oil I had forgotten to apply during my weeks of chemical exile. Now standing in the quiet foyer, I finally reached for the stack. Nestled between a utility bill and a catalog was a dry, papery envelope from the Federal Detention Center. I carried it into my workshop, the air still smelling of sawdust and the metallic tang of old tools. The letter from Thane was not the tearful apology of a prodigal son. It was a technical confession written in the precise, detached language of an engineer. He informed me that he had secretly taken out a life insurance policy on himself with me as the beneficiary, a morbid form of restitution should he not survive the fallout. But the core of the letter was a directive. Check the suspension cables, Dad, he wrote. The load is always heaviest at the anchors. I sat at my workbench, my own hands steady, and finally clear of that damning yellow dye. Still speaking in blueprints, even now I whispered to the empty room. I understood immediately. I climbed the stairs to the attic, my knees protesting the ascent, and found the broken bridge model I'd discarded years ago. Inside the balsa wood casing of the primary anchor point, I found a small black flash drive taped firmly to the frame. It contained the physical backups of the fraudulent documents Jessamine had failed to destroy, the last of the evidence Sylvia Crane's secondary network would have killed to retrieve. A prison letter is a bridge with only one lane. The words travel toward you, but you have no intention of ever driving back the other way. I secured the drive and descended to the kitchen as the evening light began to fail, casting long, peaceful shadows across the granite counters. I set up my laptop, the blue-tinted glow of the screen reflecting in the window, as I initiated the scheduled video call. For the first time in an eternity, the conversation didn't revolve around toxins or legal maneuvers. Leonie appeared first. Her face relaxed, followed by Marigold jumping into the frame. Grandpa, I used a double truss for the toothpick bridge in science class. It held 10 pounds. I felt a surge of genuine warmth, the kind that mends fractures in the soul. 10 pounds. A toothpick bridge and a 10-pound weight. It was the most beautiful calculation I'd seen in years. "That's my girl," I said, leaning toward the camera. "You remember what I told you? The triangles are the strongest shape in nature." We talked about her school and Leonie's research, and then Leonie dropped a final revelation. She had been officially appointed as a special consultant to the FBI's task force on elder fraud. Our tragedy had become her professional crusade. As I closed the laptop, the house felt quiet, not the suffocating silence of a trap, but the peaceful stillness of a finished project. The sound of Marigold's high-pitched, excited laughter still seemed to echo in the rafters. Then I looked down. Sitting on the kitchen counter, catching the dim light of the oven clock, was a single unfamiliar brass key. It hadn't been there when the call started, and its cold metallic weight promised one final lock I had yet to turn. I picked up the key, the brass cool against my palm, and realized it didn't belong to any lock in this house. I didn't call the police when I found the brass key. I recognized the bite of the tumbler, a custom-milled security ward I'd installed on a safe deposit box Patricia and I hadn't touched since the year the kids graduated. It appeared on my counter not by magic or intrusion, but by a quiet legal clockwork. Patricia's old attorney had mailed it with a formal notice following instructions to release the key only if I ever requested a full audit of my own mental competency. It was her final failsafe, a ghost, reaching out to guide my hand. The next morning, I traveled to the First National Bank. The metallic, heavy scent of the safety deposit vault greeted me like an old friend. As the clerk turned the secondary key and retreated, I pulled the steel tray into the viewing room. Inside lay a series of handwritten letters on yellowed, crisp stationery. Patricia had seen the stress fractures in our son decades ago, noting his gambling tendencies and the way he looked at our legacy as a harvest rather than a garden. She had established a contingency ledger for me to find if she ever became the silent partner in our marriage. Soren. If you're reading this, it means the foundation has shifted, her familiar script read. Trust your eyes, not your heart. I traced the ink with my thumb, a lump forming in my throat. You always were the better engineer, Trish. You saw the stress fractures before the bridge was even built. The ledger contained the original untampered trust documents, ensuring that no matter what digital lies Thane spun, the physical truth remained anchored in steel. A legacy is like a suspension bridge. It requires constant tension between the past and the future to keep the present from falling into the gorge. I realized then that my survival wasn't just a triumph of math over malice. It was the culmination of a lifelong partnership that even death couldn't dissolve. 1 month later, the Eastmoreland house was no longer a crime scene, but a command center. I sat at my desk, the warm, steady glow of the lamp pushing back the Oregon dusk, and worked with Janet Cook and Leonie on a legislative proposal. We called it Patricia's Law. It was a structural redesign for the state mandating independent audits for every private guardianship. We aren't just changing a statute, Janet, I said, watching the rhythmic, steady clack of the keyboard. We're installing a safety valve for every senior in the state. Would you have the courage to record your own son's betrayal if it was the only way to save the daughter he was using as a shield? I asked myself that every time I opened the file for my memoir. The Black Box of Legacy. The project had taken an unexpected turn when Agent Vance informed me that my recordings had been subpoenaed. They weren't being used as evidence of a crime, but as primary educational material for training new FBI agents in the psychology of predatory fraud. I had become a national expert on the very rot that nearly consumed me. I looked at the final page of Patricia's ledger and saw a small hand-drawn triangle, the strongest shape in nature, and realized that while my son had failed the stress test, the Lancaster family had never been more ironclad. I straightened my tie in the reflection of the glass-walled federal building, noting that while the lines on my face had deepened into a permanent topography of survival, my hands were as steady as a granite bedrock. 5 years had passed since the night the Lancaster name was dragged through the mud of Highway 9 years I had spent building a legislative shield for others through Patricia's Law. I walked into the hearing room, the air heavy with the smell of floor wax and stale industrial coffee. Leonie was already there, her expression a mix of professional steel and daughterly concern. Dad, you don't have to support this. she whispered as I sat beside her. The evidence of the poisoning is still on his record. I looked down at the dry, parchment-like texture of my impact statement. I'm not here to support him, Leonie. I'm here to inspect the repairs. Before the board convened, Agent Vance had pulled me aside to share a discovery that shifted my internal calculus. Thane had been anonymously funding a restitution fund for elderly fraud victims using the meager wages he earned in the prison library. It was a small data point, but in the engineering of a human soul, small corrections can signal a total shift in load-bearing capacity. I reviewed my notes, struggling with the math of a father's heart. How much mercy can a structure hold before it compromises the safety of the entire system? Forgiveness isn't a feeling. It's a structural reinforcement. You don't do it because the material deserves it. You do it so the bridge doesn't collapse under the weight of its own rust. The heavy clink of ankle shackles announced his arrival. Thane was led in, stripped of his expensive suits and the inflated ego that had once defined him. The fluorescent light reflected off his thinning hair and the sharp angles of a face that had seen the inside of a cell for 1,800 days. He didn't look like a developer anymore. He looked like a man who had finally met a load he couldn't shortcut. As he began to speak, I watched for the tells, the shifting eyes, the predatory charm, but they were absent. He offered a quiet, technical breakdown of his own failures without the usual excuses. I spent my life trying to shortcut the load-bearing requirements of a family, he said, his voice low and devoid of theater. I understand now why the structure collapsed. He looked me in the eye. For the first time in 30 years, there was no math in his gaze. Only the raw, unpolished truth. The board chairman turned to me. Mr. Lancaster, do you believe your son is a danger to the public or himself? Before I could answer, Thane spoke one last time, revealing he had requested parole to a halfway house in a different state. He didn't want the estate or the comfort of Portland. He wanted to ensure he never became a stress point for Marigold again. It was a final act of distance that felt more like a sacrifice than a betrayal. The room fell into an absolute pressurized silence as the board waited for my answer. I looked at the board, then back at the man who had once tried to erase my mind, and I realized the hardest calculation of my life wasn't how to catch him. It was whether or not to let him go. The scratch of the chair against the linoleum as I stood up to deliver my final verdict back then had been the pivot point of a decade. I had recommended Thane's parole 10 years ago, on the strict condition that he never speak to me again, making the silence a gift rather than a punishment. Now the stadium was a sea of black robes and square caps, a human tide that made the structural engineer in me calculate the weight of 10,000 futures resting on the concrete tiers. I sat in the front row, as the guest of honor, the smell of freshly cut grass and overpriced stadium popcorn swirling in the afternoon heat. I watched Marigold cross the stage, the sun glinting off the brass instruments of the university band, as she prepared to receive her degree in structural engineering. She wore the heavy silk graduation gown, with a grace that reminded me of Patricia, her stride confident and purposeful. It had been 10 years since the trial, 10 years of rebuilding the Eastmoreland house, and witnessing the quiet triumph of Patricia's law across the country. I no longer felt the phantom vibration of the scopolamine years. That fog had long since settled into a steady, clear-headed peace. As Marigold reached the center of the stage, she paused, looked directly at me and tapped the side of her head. It was our secret signal for integrity, a promise kept across a decade of recovery. She's the strongest span we ever built. Dad Leonie whispered beside me, squeezing my hand with a grip that spoke of shared scars. I shook my head slowly, my eyes never leaving my granddaughter. No, Leonie, she built herself. We just provided the bedrock. Time is the ultimate stress test. It doesn't hide the cracks, it just proves which ones were fatal and which ones could be patched with enough honesty. The roar of 10,000 people cheering simultaneously echoed through the steel girders of the roof, a sound of collective hope that filled the cavernous space. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, my internal sensors, honed by years of hypervigilance, caught a movement in the distance. I looked up toward the very last row of the nosebleed section, where a solitary figure stood against the concrete sky. It was Thane. He was gray-haired now, gaunt and weathered, fulfilling the terms of his distance-based parole. "Is that him?" Leonie asked, her voice tight. "Yes," I replied, my tone calm and analytical. "He hasn't missed a single milestone. He just knows better than to touch the glass." He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stood there like a shadow at the edge of a well-lit room. We shared a single long-distance look across the vast stadium, a silent acknowledgement of the debt paid, and the bridge that, while no longer traversable, still stands as a warning of what happens when the math of the heart is ignored. As Marigold made her way toward us through the throng of graduates, I noticed the top of her graduation cap. She had decorated it with a small hand-drawn triangle, the same one Patricia had left in her secret ledger. She knew the full story. She understood that she was the final perfect calculation. I looked at the sun hitting the steel girders of the stadium roof and realized that for the first time in a decade, I wasn't waiting for the floor to give way. The anchors were set, the load was balanced, and the Lancaster legacy was finally irreversibly secure. I set the digital recorder, the very one that had captured the whispers of my own planned erasure, on my desk next to Marigold's MIT acceptance letter. The two objects representing the burial of a nightmare and the birth of a legacy. The stadium graduation was a week behind us now, and the Eastmoreland house felt grounded, as if its foundations had finally settled deep into the basalt beneath the Portland soil. Marigold sat across from me in my study, the air smelling of old cedar and fresh ink. She was looking over her graduate school plans, her eyes bright, with the same analytical fire that had guided my life's work. "I'm going to specialize in failure analysis, Grandpa," she said, her voice steady and full of purpose. "I want to know exactly where the breaking points are before they break." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the balsa wood models that still lined the shelves. "That's the secret, Marigold. You don't build to avoid failure. You build to survive it." We discussed the full circle nature of her journey. She was moving from building bridges in our basement to designing real-world systems that could withstand the poison of time and human error. I realized then that my own work was nearly finished. "I have deeded this house to a trust," I told her, watching her reaction carefully. "It won't stay a private residence forever. Eventually, it will become a sanctuary for victims of predatory guardianship. The site of the attack will become the site of the cure. A finished book is like a decommissioned bridge. The traffic has stopped, the tolls are paid, and the structure simply exists as a testament to the fact that we once found a way across the divide." Leonie joined us, carrying a bound copy of the final draft of my memoir, The Black Box of Legacy. She placed it on the desk with a quiet reverence. "It's done, Leonie," I said, typing the final sentence, a dedication to Patricia and a warning about the invisible rot of greed. "The data is archived. The truth is structural now. You saved us, Dad," she replied. "You didn't just save your money. You saved the meaning of our name. Resilient infrastructure." It's a beautiful phrase for a family that refused to fall. I stood and led them down to the basement, to the very spot where the false walls of my life had been erected. I took the original digital recorder and placed it into a small lead-lined safe I had built into the foundation itself. The rhythmic solid click of the safe door locking sounded like a gavel. It was no longer a weapon. It was a cornerstone. I received a final letter from my publisher as we returned to the study. Patricia's law had just been adopted as a federal standard. Her name was now synonymous with the protection of the vulnerable across the entire country. I looked out the window at the garden. Patricia loved the twilight sky, turning the same deep violet as the ink on my memoir's final page. The sound of the evening crickets rose from the yard, and I felt the steady, calm beat of my own heart. I felt the last of the chemical ghosts leave the room, leaving nothing behind but the clean, cold scent of cedar and the absolute, unshakable certainty of my own mind. The bridge was solid. The load was balanced. I was home. I stood in Patricia's garden, as the evening sky turned violet, the same deep color as the ink in my memoir. The house behind me, the Eastmoreland craftsman I had restored over 30 years, no longer felt like just mine. It belonged to the future now, to survivors I would never meet, but had already begun to protect. The air smelled of rain-washed cedar and autumn leaves, a scent that reminded me endings can lead to new growth. I pulled out a folded copy of Patricia's Law from my jacket, the federal seal embossed in gold. Its weight was lighter than a single blueprint, yet it carried the structural integrity of 1,000 families who would never know they had been saved. I thought of the recorder sealed in the lead-lined safe beneath the basement floor, a black box that had documented my darkest chapter so others might avoid writing their own. The garden was quiet except for evening crickets and distant traffic. I sat on the wooden bench Patricia had chosen 20 years ago, the one carved with strong foundations, lasting love. I ran my fingers over the weathered letters. Love without vigilance is just a structure waiting to collapse. If you are listening to my story, whether you're 70 or 50 or 30, understand that what happened to me can happen to anyone. The poison doesn't always come in a pill bottle. Sometimes it comes wrapped in concern, delivered by people who are supposed to protect you. Let me share 3 engineering principles that apply to your financial life as much as to any bridge I ever designed. First, never sign anything alone. Require 2 independent signatures on every major financial document, one from a lawyer you hired, one from a financial advisor with at least a decade of your history. If someone says this is inconvenient or that you're being paranoid, that hesitation is your early warning system. A bridge doesn't fail because of one weak bolt. It fails because nobody checked the bolts. Second, your mind is your foundation. If anyone tells you that you're losing your capacity, get a second opinion from a doctor you choose, not one they recommend. Insist on a full toxicology panel if you're experiencing sudden cognitive changes, especially after starting new supplements. I was 70 and sharp enough to catch a conspiracy, but I almost didn't because I believed the fog was natural aging. It wasn't. Someone was manufacturing it. Third, love your family, but verify their respect. A child who sees you as an inheritance waiting to be liquidated will never see you as a person. Watch for the signs: escalating money requests, sudden interest in your estate offers, to streamline your finances that feel rushed. Real love doesn't have a 2-week deadline. Real care doesn't come with pre-notarized documents. I looked back at the house, its windows glowing warm in the gathering dusk. Somewhere inside, Leonie was probably reviewing case files. Somewhere across the country, Marigold was designing bridges I would never see. And somewhere in a halfway house, my son was learning that shortcuts in structural integrity always lead to collapse. The span was solid. The load was balanced. I was home. A legacy isn't what you leave in a bank account. It's the knowledge you pass forward, the systems you strengthen, and the people you protect long after you're gone. If my story saves even one person from swallowing that first capsule, from signing that first fraudulent document, then every moment of my nightmare was worth the engineering. I stood from the bench, feeling the satisfying ache of a life fully lived. The evening air was cool and clean. I walked toward the house, toward the light, toward the quiet satisfaction of a project completed. Behind me, the garden settled into twilight crickets, singing their ancient song of resilience. The black box was sealed, the bridge was standing, and the next generation already knew how to read the blueprints. Looking back at everything that happened, I realized this was never just about money or betrayal. It was about blindness. I trusted too easily. I ignored the early warning signs because I believed that love inside a family could never turn into calculation. If my family story teaches anything, it is this: never let loyalty replace awareness. Even in a family story, trust must walk beside caution. The hardest part of this family story was not losing money. It was realizing how close I came to losing my own mind. Some people call what happened dad revenge, but the truth is different. Real dad revenge was not rage or punishment. My version of dad revenge was protecting the next generation and refusing to let greed destroy my granddaughter's future. Justice mattered, but wisdom mattered more than anger. If you take anything from my experience, remember this question. What feels wrong? Protect your independence and never sign away control of your life just to keep temporary peace. I truly believe God allowed me to walk through this storm so that someone else might recognize the danger before it is too late. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you found yourself in the position of a father, discovering that his own family was secretly trying to take control of his life and assets? Please share your perspective in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories and life lessons. A small note: while this narrative draws inspiration from real-world elder fraud situations, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content isn't your preference, feel free to explore other videos on the channel that may suit you better.